Hello everyone, welcome to Talks at Google. Today's session is on Techniques of Persuasion by Mr. Sumit Dhar. Sumit is a Senior Director at EdgeVerve. It is a product subsidiary of Infosys. He is an engineering graduate from IIT-Bombay, MBA from ISB-Hyderabad, and a very well-known speaker on the international speaker circuit. I attended his session last year at the Grace Hopper conference, and the best part about his session is that it is not just informative, but then it is full of interesting stories. I really hope that you guys enjoy the session. Please welcome Mr. Sumit Dhar.
My name is Sumit, and today I'll be talking about influence techniques. But before I get started with my presentation, a couple of things that I thought I'll share with all of you. What I'm going to share over the next 1 hour or so is really the result of 10 years of research into the topic. So I hope what I share with you, all of you find it useful. Second thing, if you apply these principles, and these are very simple principles, if you apply them religiously, right, you will be able to influence. You'll be able to influence your manager, your peers, and that group which I believe is notoriously difficult to influence, your spouse and your children, right? That's my assurance to you. And third thing, as Alicia pointed out, I don't want this to be a session with dry, boring frameworks or methodologies about influence. It's going to be stories from psychology, from behavioral sciences, from economics. And these stories, via these stories, we'll understand what makes one person extremely good at influencing others. All right. With that commitment, let me start off with a simple question that we might encounter in our daily professional lives. Let's say you have 2 requests to make to your leadership, right? One of the requests is a large one. You want, say, $10,000 for a large event in the organization. The second is much smaller. You need $350 for starting something like a team library. Now, for you to be very effective, for you to get an optimal response to these requests, how should you structure them, right? There are a couple of options on the screen in front of you. Option 1. Start with the large request and then slowly move to the smaller request. So start with the $10,000 request first and then go on to the $350 request. Option 2, start with the smaller request and then move on to the larger request. And option 3, it really doesn't matter. Go whichever way you want, right? With a show of hands, how many of you are for option 1? Okay, I would say roughly 40% if I'm not mistaken. How many of you for option 2? Okay, a little lesser. How many of you for option 3? Okay, there are a few hands. And how many of you didn't raise your hand at all? All right, jokes apart. Now, here's the thing. According to science, one of these options is very effective. The other one, not so effective. Use the right option, you will significantly enhance your probability of influencing the other person. Use the wrong option, you end up with something that is suboptimal. Right? I'm not going to give you the answer right away, but stick with me for the next 45-50 minutes and you yourself will discover the answer to this question. Right? I said I'll share a lot of stories, so let me start off with the first story, that of Drubeck Brothers. Now, Drubeck Brothers ran a very successful tailoring shop in old Chicago town, and this was at the time of Great Depression. Businesses around them were failing, but somehow the Drubeck Brothers were doing exceedingly well. A lot of people attributed it to luck, but the reality was it was because of their modus operandi, the way they operated. So the way they operated was as follows. A customer would walk into their shop, and let's say this customer was looking for a suit. He would approach one of the brothers, Harry, and say, can you show me the suits? Harry would pretend to be deaf. He would say, what did you say? The customer would repeat his request louder. Can you show me some suits? So Harry would take him to the section where they had the suits. Customer would look at the suits and then finally select one. At this point, he would ask Harry, how much for the suit? Harry again would pretend to be deaf and say, what did you say? The customer would repeat his request louder. How much for the suit? So Harry would take the suit and call out to Sid, the other brother, and say, Sid, how much for the suit? Now, Sid would look up, he would see the suit and say, $60. Harry would again pretend to be deaf and say, what did you say? Sid would repeat louder, $60. At this point, without missing a beat, Harry would look at the customer and say, you heard him, $16. Right? Now put yourself in the customer's shoes. You know that that's worth $60. He's selling it to you for $16. If I were there, I would pay the $16, grab the suit, and get out of the shop before Harry or Sid discovered their mistake, right? That's what most customers would do. And the reality was that suit probably cost just $10. Now, the reason this worked is because of something called stereotypes. Human brain is a muscle, right? It receives input, it receives a lot of information, processes that information, and then takes a decision. Now, human brain is also a lazy muscle. It doesn't want to do this processing, which is very costly every time. So what does it do? It creates shortcuts. Stereotypes are nothing but these shortcuts. So the human brain can create a stereotype that men are good with machines, or children are rebellious, or women are good with languages. So when the human brain comes across a situation where it's dealing with a child that is throwing tantrums, instead of really analyzing the situation, human brain resorts to the stereotype, teenagers are rebellious. And that's exactly what happened over here, right? The human brain has a stereotype, costly equals good. And when the customer found they were getting something very expensive for a much lower price, they grabbed it, got influenced, and led to Harry and Sid becoming very rich. Now, the story of Harry and Sid has some ethical challenges with it. The next story is that from Ellen Langer, a psychologist at Harvard University. Now, Ellen Langer was studying mindfulness, and as a part of her research, came across something very interesting, which for us is meaningful. Now, what Ellen Langer was doing was trying to figure out how easy is it for someone to go ahead in a queue. So what she did was she took subjects and divided them into two groups, the control group and the experimental group. And usually in these experiments, these groups are very similar. Similar ethnicity, similar age, gender. They try to control these variables. What they do is they change just one small variable and see what's the impact of changing that variable. Now, what Ellen Langer did was, in the control group, she approached people who were standing in a queue near a Xerox machine and said, "May I please go ahead?" That was a request she made, right? 60% of the people agreed to her request. But in the experimental group, what she did was she said, "May I please go ahead because I am in a hurry." So along with what she wanted, she gave a reason, she gave a justification. And interestingly, what she found was, all of a sudden, from 60% acceptance rate, it shot up to 94% acceptance. What she concluded is, whenever you are requesting someone something, it's always good if you can provide a reason, a justification along with it. Now, it's a simple observation, a simple conclusion. When I heard about it, I asked myself one question: do I always do this? And the answer to that was a no. So the first lesson, the first tip, the first technique, whatever you want to call it, is whenever you have a request, whenever you want something from the other person, try and provide a justification with it. Why is it that you want that? All right, let me move on to a quick question. Over here, we've got some folks. I want to ask you all, do you guys feel influence techniques are important? And if yes, why? Why are they important in this day and age? Please go ahead.
I think in this day and age, it's extremely important because you're no longer working for one person. You are
Good.
the only one who is kind of dealing with things like that, right?
So you're not dealing with one person. There are multiple people that you need to interact with. So multiple people need to be influenced. Okay, that's a fair point. What else? Any other reasons why influencing others is important?
Organizational boundaries are dissolving.
Mm-hmm.
It's increasingly matrix where resources are very scarce and prioritization needs to happen.
Very important, yeah.
And not everything is weighed properly around where's the right place to put the resource.
Sure.
So many times the success of your initiative will depend upon how much you are able to influence
Absolutely.
across.
Absolutely. I think resources are scarce, whether it's money that you want for a project or someone's time, it's not easily available. And people who can convince others, people who can influence others, people who can persuade others will always have an edge in such an environment. Any other reasons before we move on?
Get the work done.
Yes, ma'am. To get the work done, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Organizations are not as hierarchical anymore, so the ability to influence
Absolutely,
without
absolutely.
is really critical.
Perfect. Yeah, earlier in a lot of industries, authority was used to drive work because the boss said so was good enough to get things done. But now in the kind of organizations we have, pretty flat, and often you can question what your boss has said, right? You might say this is not right. So at that point, influencing others becomes a critical trait. And I'll follow this up with another question. How many of you over here believe influence skills are inherent? That is, you're born with these skills. These are not some things that you can learn easily. Anyone over here thinks that way? No? Fantastic. Makes my job so much easier. So here's what we're going to do. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I'll talk about 5 or 6 principles. These are principles that have been tested, that have been researched and proven by science to be effective when it comes to influencing people, right? And all of them are simple. There's nothing complex about any of these principles. The only thing we need to do is, when we are trying to influence others, keep these in mind and use them appropriately. Appropriately being a keyword, because you have to use these principles ethically. I'll come back to that, because there's a very thin line between influencing someone and manipulating someone. So towards the end, we will focus a little on this part, but for the time being, let me get into the first principle, which is the principle of contrast. Now, here's a thought experiment. Dip your hand in a bucket, right hand in a bucket of water at 50 degrees centigrade, all right? Your left hand in a bucket of water at 20 degrees. Keep them there for a couple of seconds, pull them out, and put them in a bucket of water at 35 degrees. What do you think? Is this water hot, cold? What do you feel? You feel different sensations. What exactly do you feel?
It's like the right hand feels it's
Cold?
really cold and
Left hand feels it's hot. And the reason I'm sharing this example is the human brain's response to a situation that is facing at this point can be tweaked, can be influenced by an experience it's had a few seconds or even a few minutes earlier. That's exactly what the contrast principle is. So let me give you an example. I'll give you examples as I go through the presentation, either from research or in some cases from business. And how you apply them in your day-to-day lives, I'll leave it to you, right? Because I can't provide you a direct answer to how you can use it, but these examples should probably help. Now, let's say you go to a high-end retail store and you ask the salesperson over there for a suit and a pair of socks. Guess what he will show you first? Suit, the most expensive, okay. Anyone who says a pair of socks? No? Okay, you're all right. He will show you the suit first, and the reason for that is very simple. Let's say you decide that you like a suit at around $15,000 rupees. After that, a pair of socks at 500 rupees, by contrast, looks cheap. On the other hand, you buy a pair of socks at 100 rupees, and then he shows you a suit at 5,000 rupees. Because of the contrast principle, it starts appearing expensive. So if he's a smart salesman, he will show you the expensive item first to utilize the contrast effect. And the same thing happens in real estate. A lot of brokers, if you go to them that I want to buy a flat or I want to rent a flat, you'll give them very clear indications. This is what I'm looking for, this kind of house in this neighborhood with these kind of additional facilities, right? Irrespective of what you say, the first house they show you will typically be a lousy one in a lousy neighborhood at an exorbitant rent, right? The next one that they show you will be aligned to what you have told them, but maybe 25% more than what you indicated was your willingness to pay. What happens in this case is, because of the contrast principle, in such a lousy house, in such a lousy neighborhood at double the price, but now this one is available at just 25% more than what I'm willing to pay, your willingness to pay for that goes up. This is another example of contrast principle. Sometime back, I was reading a fantastic book. This is now moving on to business. How do businesses use the contrast principle? There's this fantastic book called Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. Anyone over here has gone through that book? It's a fantastic book. If you just have some time and want to read something interesting, just pick this up. You will not regret it. Now, in that book, he talks about a very interesting situation. The Economist magazine had 2 subscription options on their website. The first was a digital-only subscription, economist.com. You get access to the articles, you get access to all the documents, etc. This was for $59. The second one was where you had access to the digital as well as the print copy. The digital only was around $60 and the print copy plus digital was $125. The management at Economist obviously wanted people to go for option 2. But unfortunately, most people were going for the digital only version. So what they did was, instead of showing 2 options, they threw up 3. The middle one was print subscription, $125. So there's no digital in it. 32% of people who were going with print subscription, all of a sudden in this case, it shot up to 82%. So this is the contrast principle being used by organizations, by businesses. So from the contrast principle, let me move on. Let me move on to the second technique: reject, retreat, and repeat. Start off with a large request. If it will get rejected, that's fine. Don't negotiate, don't haggle. Instead, move on to a smaller request. The probability that the smaller request will get accepted is much higher if you follow this process than if you were to make that request directly. Right? So let's see an example from science. Here, the experiment that I want to share with you all is done by Professor Robert Cialdini at Arizona State University. So what Robert Cialdini did was he took some subjects for this experiment, divided them into the control group and the experimental group. Now, in the control group, he asked these subjects, would you be okay spending 8 hours over the weekend taking care of juvenile delinquents? 17% of them said, sure, we'll do it over this weekend. He said, fair enough. Then he moved on to the experimental group. In the experimental group, he didn't start off directly with his request. What he did was, he said to the people in the experimental group, I want you to take care of these juvenile delinquents for the next 52 weeks, right? For the whole year, 8 hours per weekend. Now, as you can expect, no one wanted to take on this responsibility, and everyone effectively told him, have you lost your mind or something? They said, no, we're not doing it. So 0%. He said, fair enough. He moved on very quickly to the second request. How about this weekend? Compared to the 17% that he had got in the first scenario, in this case, 54% accepted it when he started off with a much larger request and quickly moved on to a smaller request. So this is the reject, retreat, repeat principle. So if you have 2 requests to make, always start off with the smaller or the larger request. Larger request. If it gets accepted, fantastic. Move on to the smaller request by contrast principle. It seems so small, it will get accepted. If the first one has been rejected, quickly move on to the smaller request. Because of the reject retreat principle, it's probable that it will get accepted much faster. Now, a lot of youngsters over here, you wouldn't have had this experience, but there was a time when people would come to your house with encyclopedias, A to Z, will you buy the whole set? Their starting point was always the whole set. I don't think anyone ever has bought the whole set in one go, but their starting point was always a larger request. Why don't you purchase the whole set? If you said no, that was fine. They quickly moved on to a much smaller request. How about A to M or A to L? You said no to that, no problem, much smaller request. How about just letter A? You said no to that, that's also fine. How about recommending someone that I can go and try selling this book to? So starting with a large request, they constantly kept moving on to a much smaller request. And at some point, they did get what they were looking for. So this is another example where people have used this principle. And guess who's really good at using this principle? Who said that? Absolutely. They are masters at using this. I have a 5-year-old son. He's just turned 5. He knows that we will never allow him to drive the car, right? But he loves blowing the horn on the car. So once we have parked the car, he will come up, Papa, can I drive the car? He knows the answer to that. I said, no. Even before I've said no completely, he said, okay, can I at least blow the horn? So he knows the way he structures his request makes a huge impact. Let me kind of explain what it says. Dennis goes to his mom and says, if I can't have a horse, the larger request, can I have a cookie at least? The much smaller request. And mom says, I guess that's the least we can do. Who would believe it? An invisible horse worth its weight in cookies. So Dennis got what he wanted by using this principle. The other cartoon is from Calvin and Hobbes, and Calvin starts off with his larger request. Mom, can I set the mattress on fire? Mom is, of course not. Okay, can I then ride the cycle on the roof? Mom is, of course not. Finally, he says, can I at least have a cookie? And mom says the answer to that is still a no. These cartoons do illustrate the principles that we talked about. ISKCON effectively used this. Here's what they did. ISKCON was looking for donations for their organization. So what they did was passengers disembark, they approach them and give them an American flag. Now, patriotic Americans found it difficult to keep the flag on the floor. Reciprocity built up, checkbook whipped out, donation done. It went on so much so that finally the aviation authorities in US banned ISKCON from soliciting donations at the airport. right? So this is reciprocity being used, the principle of reciprocity being used, but in a slightly unethical way. The principle is powerful, right? And we need to make sure that we don't mess it up. What do I mean by messing it up? Don't do someone a favor just because you need something from them in return, right? The worst thing you can do is, if you need something tomorrow in the evening, go and do something for them. That's not the right way. Go ahead and do things for others, right? If you're interested, if people over here like reading, read this book called Give and Take by Professor Adam Grant, and you will believe that doing things for others is the right thing to do. And once you start doing it naturally, you will find people more and more willing to do things that you ask them in return, right? And I presented this at GSC, and at that time I had given an interesting insight. I was reading some papers by Professor Adam Grant, and guess what he found? When a woman at workplace does something for a male colleague, what do you think the reciprocity is? Is it equal to when a male colleague does something for a male colleague, lesser than or more than? The level of reciprocity that is built up. Okay, how many of you for more than? Okay. Oh, practically the whole room. How many of you say lesser than? Yeah, a couple. The sad part is somehow when women help others, it doesn't have the same level of impact. It is much lower. The reason could be a stereotype that people believe women are supposed to be more helpful, therefore they don't give them credit. I shared this at GHC. How do you deal with this? How, when you feel that you're not getting the right level of reciprocity, you're not getting the right level of support, how do you deal with it? What do you do? Any thoughts? So here's what scientists found. When you've done a favor for someone and he says thank you, what do you tell them? You're welcome, no problem, right? That's what we say most of the times. And that's where you lose an important opportunity to build reciprocity. What science says is the moment you've done something for a male colleague and he says thank you, say, I know you'd have done the same for me, won't you? Right? You can't grab him by a collar and say, you owe me one, right? You can't do that. But you can certainly tell him, the next time I need something, I'm sure you would have done it for me, right? So reciprocity is built in a subtle way, in a nice way, and next time you need some help in return, you will get it much easier. All right, so we've talked about the reciprocity principle. Let me move on to the next principle, which is social validation. Again, a very simple principle. If you look at these, all of these principles are very simple. Now, what social validation says is, we are more likely to do something that we see others around us doing. So if you ask someone to do something that others are doing, they are more likely to agree to it. All right? The experiment that I want to talk about over here is something that was done by Professor Albert Bandura. He is one of the most well-known psychologists in the world, the most well-known living psychologist. And he was extremely successful at curing phobias in children. Now, parents came to him with children who had phobias of dogs, of cats, of heights, of open spaces, of closed spaces, whatever, right? And here's how. The traditional methods, their success rate was much low. I believe it was lesser than 10%. Here's what Albert Bandura did. He would show these children, let's say a child is afraid of dogs. What he would do is show these children videos of other kids like them, same age, same ethnicity, same gender, playing with dogs, playing with puppies, right? What is the message he was trying to send to them? That other kids are not scared. The next step is he would take them to a playpen where other kids were playing with puppies, were playing with dogs. Again, reinforcing the message, others like you are doing exactly this. There's nothing to be afraid. Third step was he would place them in the playpen and slowly ask other kids to move out. Constantly reinforcing the message that others like you are doing this. There's nothing to be scared, there's nothing wrong with it. And guess what? He was extremely successful in curing these kids of their phobia. Up to 70% success rate was what Albert Bandura had, using the principle of social validation. Now, social validation also has a dark side. I don't know how many of you have noticed, the moment there is a report of a suicide in the newspapers, all of a sudden, the number of suicides goes up. That's because people who have had such similar thoughts, the moment they see something like this in the news, they believe it's an acceptable thing to do. And the interesting part of that research is, if the person who committed suicide was, let's say, a white male, increasingly the number of follow-on suicides will be white males. If it was a black male, it increasingly will be black males. If it was someone who committed suicide by ramming his car against a wall, increasingly the follow-on suicides will be people who committed this act by dashing their cars against a wall or a tree. So that's the dark side of social validation. Now, sometime back I saw this interesting TED talk where Alex Lasky demonstrated the power of social validation. So Alex Lasky was working in a part of California, I don't remember which, I think San Marcos or one of those places, and trying to help people reduce their electricity consumption, right? So what he did was he divided the households in that city into 4 different groups and gave each of them a different message that would encourage them to save power. And over the month, they measured what was the change in their behavior. So in the first group, what he said was save money, right? You can save up to $55 per month by switching off fans and ACs when you don't need it. So that was the message that was given to the first group. In the second group, he said save the environment, right? By switching off fans and ACs when you don't need them, you will be saving the environment. And in the third group, he gave the message, be a good Samaritan. By switching off fans and ACs when you don't need them, you will prevent blackouts in the city. Guess which of these 3 options was most effective at getting people to reduce their consumption? Save money. That's exactly what I thought, right? Be a good citizen. Yeah, that's a good possibility. You know what? None of these worked. The change, the delta in their consumption was close to 0. Now, this would not be an interesting story if it ended over here. I said they divided people into 4 groups. The 4th group was one where they sent a message saying, people like you are switching off fans and ACs when they don't need them. Won't you join them? So it was more of a social validation. You know, people like you are doing this. Why are you not doing it? And guess what? This helped people all of a sudden reduce their power consumption. This method was so effective, they got people to save 2 terawatts of power. And this became a process by which a lot of cities in California started saving power. So that's the power of social validation. How do you use it? Let's say you have an interesting idea that you want to pitch to your management. If you can show that other business units, other teams, other organizations like yours are already doing this, the probability that the idea will be accepted becomes much higher, right? So that's social validation. Let's move on to the next one. When you go to a lot of these malls, they have this tip jar, right? You have a nice transparent plexiglass case where people would have donated money for some cause, right? One thing you will notice is these jars are always transparent and they are always full of money. The reason being that organization is sending across a message that people like you have donated money. Won't you do the same, right? So these are all examples of people, organizations, companies using social validation to gain greater access to your wallet. The 5th principle that I want to talk about is called commitment and consistency principle. Like other principles, it's very simple. What the commitment and consistency principle says is that you are more likely to influence someone to a particular thought that you have if before sharing that thought you get a commitment from them to that cause, right? That's quite a mouthful of what I have said. Let me change it. Let me share an example which will make it very clear. So the example that I want to share is from Steve Sherman. What Steve Sherman did was he was approached by the American Cancer Society and they wanted his help in terms of increasing the donations to their organization. So here's what Steve did. He took the address book, divided people into 2 groups. First group, he called them and said, hey, will you donate to American Cancer Society? People donated a certain amount. That was fine. In the second group, he called them and said, hey, do you support the work that's being done by American Cancer Society? Not wanting to be uncharitable, everyone said, yes, of course we do. A week or 2 later, he called them again. If the opportunity arose and you were in a position to support the American Cancer Society, will you do it? Again, not wanting to be uncharitable, what did people say? Yes. So even before he made his real request, he had built commitment in their hearts to the American Cancer Society. Third week, he called them and said, will you donate to the American Cancer Society? Because these people had already committed to the cause of American Cancer Society, when he asked them for donation, there was a much higher number of people who agreed to his request. And the impact was staggering. It was not a 100 or 200%. The difference was 700% from the control case. So this is what I personally believe to be one of the most powerful principles of influence. All right, I'll come to the last technique that I have. It's the principle of authority. And I think all of us inherently understand the principle of authority. We tend to do things that are asked by people who are in a position of authority, right? And this principle is very applicable in case of Asian cultures. Asians are more likely to agree to things that come from someone in position of authority. Now, there's an interesting experiment done by Stanley Milgram. In this, what he did was he called for volunteers for a learning experiment. So people signed up. There was one teacher and there was a learner. The learner was given a long list of words to memorize. After the person had memorized this list, he was made to sit on one side of a wall and a contraption was plugged onto his fingers. At the other side of the wall, there was a teacher who was given something like this. And the teacher was given the list of words that the person had memorized. The learner would then recite these words. As long as he was giving the right word in the right order, everything was fine. The moment he made a mistake, the teacher would flick a switch over here and that contraption would deliver an electric shock to the learner. It started off at 10 volts and went all the way up to 450 volts. There was a person in position of authority who would come and constantly tell the teacher, go ahead, give the shock. 100% of the volunteers went up to 360 volts. If I remember correctly, around 70% or 80% went all the way up to 450 volts. So when Nazi criminals at Nuremberg trials said we did it because we were told to do so, it was not technically incorrect. There is a lot of evidence which says when someone in position of authority asks you to do something, even if it is unethical, even if it's immoral, people do tend to do it. If anyone is interested, I'll be sharing the presentation with Alicia. Here are some of the references, some additional reading material that you might find interesting, you might enjoy reading. I thought it would be good to list it out. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll end with a request and a hope. First, I hope you all found this useful. I hope you found some interesting ideas that you can use in your day-to-day life. And I request you to use all these principles ethically. It's very easy to misuse them, to move from influence to manipulation, but I hope all of you over here will use these principles in the right spirit, in the right manner.